Dagwood here. So we're going to be reading more on the life of actor Jim Varney, or the importance of being Ernest, the life of actor Jim Varney, stuff that Vern doesn't even know. I always forget this little parenthetical by Justin Lloyd. So we've already been working on the book a little bit, so we're going to be doing chapters 5 and 6. So, uh, all right. So here we go. Chapter 5. Anne and her mother. Wait, Anne, her mother, and the finer things. Anne, her mother, and the finer things. All right, we got it out. When Jim was around 13, he met a girl who would have become one of his best girlfriends and eventually a lifelong friend. One day, Jim and a buddy were running down the street from the bus stop to rehearsal at Children's Theater in the pouring rain. Anne Lambert's big house was just around the corner. From her porch, she saw the two boys running, and she was yelling for them to come up to dry off. They told her where they were headed, and she mentioned that her mother had been an actress in New York. All of a sudden, the friendly girl about their age became a lot more interesting to the boys. After Lambert introduced Jim to her mother Jane, he became captivated with stories of her acting career. He began spending more and more time at the Lambert house. Anne Lambert remembers Jim being much more interested in her mother than her at first, along with stories about working in the theater. Jane Lambert also taught Jim such manners as dining etiquette. Jim believes that she saw Jim was a diamond in the rough who needed polishing. Anne Lambert and Jim dated for a short time in high school. They loved going to the movies. Lambert recalls seeing Beckett, starring Peter O'Toole and Richard Burton. With Jim in the spring of 1964, to Lambert's amazement after the movie, Jim gave dead-on impersonations of the two leading men. The movie became one of his all-time favorites. Jim also loved to watch Sean Connery in the 5 Bond films released from the time Jim was 13 to 18. Jim was impressed with how refined Connery was as Bond, as well as how he used his good looks and suave demeanor to attract the most beautiful girls. Bond girls may have been out of Jim's reach, but he discovered that a Rolex similar to Bond's was not as elusive. The most affordable Rolex he could find was $125. A lot of money at that time, and especially for a teenager. He made a deal with a local jeweler to buy it on a payment plan. Jim asked the jeweler to engrave 007 on the back. He wore that watch for years, and as an adult, whenever he gave someone a watch, which was often, it was usually a Rolex. Well, I didn't know that. In addition, Jim admired a lesser-known actor to American audiences, Francis Jean Paul Belmondo, in contrast to Connery. Jim probably identified more than Belmondo's unconventional good looks. If there was one real negative about Jim's love of acting during his teenage years, it was that he became more and more critical of his appearance. Compared to his favorite actors, such as Connery and O'Toole, Jim's larger nose and wide mouth were just not up to par. And physically, he had the skinnier build of his mother, not the boxer's frame of his father. He was already thinking about how his looks would affect the types of roles he would be offered as an adult, even though Jim desperately wanted to be the hero who got the girl. He thought he would probably be cast as the villain. He seemed resigned to the fact that he would be limited to the small screen, playing in series such as Playhouse 90 and the Hallmark Hall of Fame. Jim's preoccupation with his looks worsened as he entered puberty, and like many kids, endured his share of acne. Mary Warner Ford tried to tell him that a character actor such as himself would never need to worry about having movie idol looks. She thought he was handsome enough in his own right, although Jim never saw that when comparing himself to others. Jake once asked Jim a riddle where a person must decide if they would rather have beauty, wealth, or fame. By choosing one, he could never attain the others. Jim didn't hesitate for a second. Beauty, he replied. With that choice, Jake reminded him that he would never be rich or famous. Jim said he didn't care, but then he added that there should be another choice. Jim said that if love was one of the options, he would choose that. Jake thought it was an unusual response for a 14-year-old. Jim spent a fair amount of free time by himself in his early to mid teens. Since his mother never learned to drive and his father was at work, he would either walk or ride the bus. One place he loved to frequent was a cigar store downtown on Main Street. He would buy magazines, cigarettes, and occasionally cigar or pipe. Jim began smoking Marlboros around 13. He called them Marley Barleys. Occasionally he bought Benson and Hedges, perhaps because they were considered more of an upscale brand. They suck, by the way, at least nowadays. Jim couldn't afford many of the things he wanted as a teenager, but when he did save up the cash, he enjoyed spending it on items that gave him a taste of how the upper class lived, such as gourmet cheeses, chocolates, and English toffee. He liked to talk about his knowledge of these finer things, such as how the English referred to gumdrops as wine gums. Not even a simple candy treat was beyond the reach of his historical knowledge. As far as clothing, Jim loved the feel of cashmere. Although he couldn't afford a cashmere coat, he did find a way to scrap up enough money for a scarf. He always said that he had expensive feet because cheap shoes were often painful for him to wear. He loved anything made of leather and enjoyed wearing soft leather loafers and boots. Jim's interest in jewelry and knives continued to grow in his teenage years. He kept a cigar box in his bedroom full of all types of jewelry and trinkets that he had collected and received as gifts. He loved to go through the box, almost as much as he was studying some of the pieces for the first time. He would read up on their characteristics until he could talk at length about each one. For example, he would tell you about how one of his railroad wristwatches had a lever to set the time. And as an adult, Jim created what he called a curiosity table at his home in Tennessee. The big round oak table in his den was covered with dozens of items such as old coins, telescopes, gears, knives, and so on. He invited anyone visiting to inspect the items, and he would explain what made them unique. Jim loved giving jewelry as a gift almost as much as he did buying it for himself. Starting as a teenager, he would give almost every female he knew a watch, and the present always included a lesson on how to operate and care for it. He found many vintage watches in pawn shops and second-hand stores. When he found an old watch that caught his eye, he would bring it home, polish it up, and buy a new band for it. He loved bringing to life a piece whose value he felt someone else had overlooked. As an adult, Jim had jeweler's loupes, magnifiers, attached to a pair of glasses. A pronounced crease would appear between Jim's eyes when he would inspect something. His intense curiosity would almost convince you he was a visitor from another planet. He would marvel for hours at the workmanship of Swiss watches and the detail in hand-etched coins. He didn't collect something for its value as much as he did out of admiration for the craftspeople who had made it. He could spend hours cleaning and polishing pieces in his collection. It was a calming pastime. Beginning as a teenager, Jim enjoyed wearing a variety of pieces of jewelry, including a signet ring given to him by his father. For most of his adult life, there were about 6 pieces he constantly wore: a small loop earring, a silver chain bracelet, a Celtic cross necklace, numerous rings, one of which displayed the thespian masks, and his stainless steel Rolex. Some of these pieces were even visible when he was dressed as Ernest, His jewelry represented his many interests while reflecting the diversity of his personality. Well, the more you know. All right, Chapter 6. The Varney Parkers. One particular photograph of Jim and his father was always been a family favorite. In it, Jim is about 15. He leans back against a car while standing next to his father in a parking lot. They both wear hats with the word parking inscribed across the front. To bring in more income, James Sr. formed a small business parking cars that the family affectionately referred to as the Varney Parkers. Along with Jim and his father, the Parkers usually consisted of Jim's cousins Ed, Wynn, and Jack McCord, as well as many of their friends, including some of Jack's college buddies. Starting the little business seemed like a logical choice to James Sr. after working as a parking attendant at Keeneland during the racing season. He had business cards printed up and started handing them out. When someone called, he would decide how many men he would need for the job and then figure $5 per man. Wedding receptions brought in their biggest business. In addition to tips, delicious leftovers often came with the job. When Jim started working with the guys, he was too young to drive, so he would direct Parkers into their spots. During the event, the men hung out by the cars, cracking jokes and listening to James Sr. tell stories. Of course, Jack, Wynn, and Ed respected their uncle immensely and in many ways saw him as larger than life. His stories never failed to captivate them, whether they were about his boxing exploits or tales of the gigantic pythons he had encountered in the Philippines. Ed would later recall a particularly memorable story where, as a teenager working in the mines, his Uncle Jim had gotten into an argument with another teenage boy. The boy left and soon returned with his father. The story goes that James Sr. ended up whipping both of them. Despite his humble beginnings as a teenage coal miner with a ninth grade education, Jim's father demonstrated to the young men that in life anything was possible. Well, that's the end of that chapter. And so we'll do the next two chapters on the next one. I'm enjoying this book. All right, we'll see you next time.